It began with a revelation so shocking that even seasoned intelligence officers froze in their seats. A thick dossier marked "The Future Treaty" was laid out in front of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso. On the surface, the treaty was presented as a document of cooperation, a health initiative backed by the WHO, funded by billionaires like Bill Gates, supported by Klaus Schwab and the Davos elite. But the fine print told a different story, a hidden blueprint that would strip nations of their sovereignty, dissolve their ability to make independent decisions, and hand power over to unelected global elites. The plan was marketed as progress, as safety, as the Great Reset. But to Traoré, it was nothing less than an act of reoccupation disguised as help. The real reason behind Traoré's thunderous no was not just pride or nationalism. It was the survival of freedom itself. Behind the polished speeches, carefully staged conferences, and glossy promises of aid, the future treaty demanded something unthinkable: complete control over African nations' health systems, financial policies, and even their cultural independence. It promised free vaccines, global funding, infrastructure support, but buried in its clauses was the surrender of emergency powers, the loss of local governance, and the centralization of all health decisions in Geneva, thousands of miles away from the people whose lives were at stake. When Traoré first read the document, his voice cut through the silence of the National Security Chamber. This is not health. This is not protection. This is a contract of chains, and we will not sign it. His refusal shocked not just Burkina Faso but the entire world. Why? Because until then, few leaders had dared to speak openly against the Great Reset. Many had quietly signed, tempted by promises of funding or threatened with the fear of sanctions. But Traoré saw through the mask. He understood the real reason. The treaty was never about saving lives. It was about controlling them. Investigators soon uncovered encrypted hard drives, secret emails from Davos operatives, and financial transactions linking Burkina Faso's former ministers to foreign accounts in Switzerland and Luxembourg. The evidence was damning. It revealed a system where personal benefits for elites were exchanged at the cost of national sovereignty. In one email, a foreign lobbyist promised a seat on a prestigious international board in exchange for Burkina Faso's compliance. Another memo detailed how non-compliant states would face punishment, aid cuts, embargoes, and international isolation. Traoré slammed his fist on the table. They call it aid. I call it laundering. They call it cooperation. I call it betrayal. His words electrified not just his cabinet but the entire African continent. And this is the real reason his no matters. It was not just a rejection of a treaty, but a declaration of independence against a system designed to recolonize Africa through economic pressure, health dependency, and digital surveillance. Day by day, more revelations spilled out. The future treaty outlined a plan to centralize DNA databases, to enforce global digital IDs tied to health status, and to link every financial transaction to a centralized digital currency controlled not by African banks, but by Western institutions. In simple terms, Africans would no longer own their identities, their health, or their economies. Everything would be monitored, tracked, and dictated from abroad. For the West, this was presented as efficiency. For Traoré, it was slavery under a new name. That's why when international media tried to paint him as an extremist, millions of Africans rallied behind him. They understood the deeper truth. This was not just about Burkina Faso, it was about the dignity of an entire continent. On live television, Traoré held up the treaty before the people and ripped it apart page by page. This is their future, he declared. But it is not ours. Our future will be written by our people, not by Davos. The crowd roared with chants of freedom, their voices echoing across the streets of Ouagadougou. Social media exploded with clips of the moment. Hashtags like "No to Great Reset" and "Howl's Future Off Freedom" spreading like wildfire from Lagos to Johannesburg. Even as Western nations threatened sanctions, economic blockades, and media smears, the tide was turning. Russia pledged food and fuel. China offered credit lines outside of Western banking systems. Turkey sent medical supplies with a message: health cannot be sanctioned. Venezuela and Iran declared solidarity. Far from isolating Burkina Faso, Traoré's defiance exposed a global fault line. The world was no longer united under Western dominance. The real reason he said no was not arrogance, but clarity. He knew that if Africa surrendered to this treaty, it would never regain its independence. It would become a testing ground for global digital governance, a laboratory for vaccine experiments, a marketplace controlled by foreign interests. In Addis Ababa at the African Union, Traoré presented the proof: emails ordering protests to be staged, contracts offering bribes, financial flows linking aid to obedience. His words shook the chamber. This is not global health, this is recolonization. They want our children as experiments, they want our sovereignty as their property, and we will not allow it. Delegates from Mali, Niger, and Guinea stood in defiance, declaring their own refusal. For the first time in decades, Africa spoke with one voice. Meanwhile, the West erupted with threats. Washington warned of consequences. Brussels discussed sanctions. Paris announced it could no longer work with a government that rejected the so-called international order. But the people had already chosen their side. In Independence Square, a craftsman molded the ashes of the burned treaty into a clay bell. When it hardened, Traoré lifted it before thousands. "This is the bell of freedom," he declared. "It will ring for Africa, and when it sounds, no empire can silence it." That bell became more than a symbol. It was the heartbeat of a movement. Videos of its ringing spread across the continent, inspiring protests, rallies, and declarations of unity. Farmers, students, elders, and soldiers alike declared their loyalty not to Davos, but to freedom. The real reason Traoré said no was not just to protect Burkina Faso, but to ignite a fire across Africa. He understood that one nation's defiance could become the spark for a continental awakening. And he was right. Today, when the world speaks of the Great Reset, they no longer see a silent continent waiting to obey. They see a continent rising to ask difficult questions. Who truly benefits from these treaties? Who writes the rules? And why should Africa always be the testing ground? The truth is, Traoré's no is bigger than a single treaty. It is a warning to the world. Africa will not be controlled. Its future will not be dictated, and its sovereignty is not for sale. And that is the real reason he stood firm. Not for politics, not for applause, but for freedom itself. Because when one leader dares to rise and refuse the chains, he doesn't just change his nation. He changes the course of history.